It works, I think. Oh yeah, we need sound effects in this presentation. Dang, I didn't think about that. Next time. So welcome everyone to my presentation on CSS Grid. My name is Tyler and I'm a Drupal developer, shocker. I work at Open Software, and just a little bit more about me. I've been in web development for about 3+ years in both web development and Drupal. I am Acquia certified Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 developer. As I mentioned, work at Open Software, and I just love making things look awesome. I love front-end web development. It's been my primary focus for the last few years. I do other things as well, but it's a thing I love doing, and there's nothing better than actually turning a design, making a design, like porting your design onto a web, and it actually looks like the design and interacts as you would expect it. And that's one of the reasons why I want to present CSS Grid today, because that's one of the things that actually helps with it. It makes your life a little bit easier. So before I start, how many of you have heard of CSS Grid? Okay, so a few of you. And how many of you have either experimented with it or use it on an active basis in your development? Okay, perfect. There's actually quite a few people. So what we'll do today is, first we'll start with a little introduction to CSS Grid. Then I'll go over some terminology and concepts. We'll run across Grid, go over some Grid properties and values you see in CSS. The Grid functions, that would be helpful to the whole development process. And then go over to more pros and cons of CSS Grid, some of the browser support for it, comparing it to other grid systems, and then ending it with some question and answers. We started a little bit late, but I'm sure we'll still have time for a bit of Q&A at the end. So yeah, let's begin. I'll start with a quote from a good site if you're into just trying to figure out CSS problems, CSS tricks. They mentioned, as of March 2017, most browsers ship native unprefixed support for CSS Grid. So this includes Chrome on Android, Firefox, Safari, including iOS, and Opera. Even Internet Explorer 10 and 11 support it, but it's an older implementation with an outdated syntax. I'll get into that a bit later because I have actually had to work with that sort of implementation. But yeah, the time to build with Grid is now. And it's true. I've started building it for a lot of my projects in the last few months, and I can say with confidence that it definitely helps a lot and makes things look a lot better too. So what is CSS Grid? CSS Grid is a two-dimensional grid system. And what I mean by that, it's a system made of columns and rows. Whereas if you used Flexbox before, you'd only be able to use columns or rows in your specifications in there. CSS Grid uses both of them together. And it's based on this structure of a grid container and the grid items within it. As you see by this image over here, there's a surrounding grid container that holds everything together, and then all the grid items evenly spaced out inside. It's available in vanilla CSS. As I mentioned before, all the browsers that support, a lot of modern browsers support it, and older browsers like IE 10 and 11 support some of the properties within CSS Grid. So you don't need any sort of browser extension or framework to get it working. You just type in your CSS as usual and use the properties for CSS Grid, and it works. And it's great for using for large page layouts. So let's say you're laying out your page, your header, your main content, sidebar, and footer. It's great for instances like that. But you can also use it for smaller elements as well. It's not just limited to that kind of instance. So I'll get into some of the terminology you'll come across with Grid. So I mentioned earlier there's a grid container and there's a grid item. The grid container is where you would apply display grid to allow grid to be used within these properties. Allow it to be used within this specific element and its children elements. So it's like a parent and child relationship. So you have the parent, which is container, and then you have the child items under it, which are the grid items. And you can see by these, my fancy drawings here, the grid container is the blue outline in the background there. And then the grid items are the blocks within it, like the 3 blocks. Then you have other items too. You have the grid line, which is like sort of the dividers between each part of the grid. So if you have a 3-column grid, the lines between the grid, if you have them, if you don't have them, if you don't have padding or anything like that, then it doesn't really, but each of the lines is a grid line that separates the grid. And then you have a grid track, which specifies the space between 2 adjacent grid lines. So like basically a whole row or a whole column. So in this example here, the white specifies a whole row is a grid track. And that'll come across when I explain some of the properties you can use in grid. And then you have a grid cell. It's basically a single unit within a grid. So if you look at this this picture at the bottom here, the white cell, or the white part of it, specifies a single cell. This is space between 2 adjacent columns and rows. And then you have a grid area. I won't talk too much about grid areas in this presentation because it's a little bit more complex, it requires a bit more time. But essentially an area is something you can specify within your grid properties, and allows you to say, I want to apply this grid item to this area. So for example, here you can specify the whole white part there as a grid area. And there's an important concept in CSS Grid that you should understand. So it's a concept of explicit versus implicit grid. So explicit is me telling grid, this is exactly what I want. I want a 3-column grid with 1 row. So at the top there, that's exactly what I mentioned. But then it doesn't know how to handle extra elements that you input in there. And that's where the implicit grid comes in. So explicit says this is what I want. Implicit is implied. It says, okay, if I have any extra elements, then I'll apply 100 pixels or whatever to those elements. And then at the bottom, you can see this is where if I specify the grid auto property, then any extra elements I apply to the grid will just automatically adjust. That's kind of the idea between explicit and implicit. Yeah. I was going to ask a question, but I realized, probably not the best time right now. I'll wait till the end. So let's go over some grid properties that you'll be using when you use CSS Grid. We'll start with the container properties, because majority of the properties you'll probably use are within the actual grid container. And as mentioned, the grid container is the outside element that kind of controls the whole grid. So in here, it's represented by the div with the class grid container. And then everything within it is just your standard divs. Like it's just, I added a class item 1, 2, and 3 just for use later on. But the whole idea is like you have the grid items. You apply display grid on the grid container, and that activates grid and allows you to use the properties that are available. And two properties you'll be using a lot are grid template columns and grid template rows. This tells tells grid this is what I want my template. This is what I want the explicit grid to be. So in this example, I have grid template columns 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. Grid template rows 100 pixels, 100 pixels. You may be able to see it right now, but that's pretty much what creates this grid at the top here. It says, okay, I want a 3-column grid, so that's why you have 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, you have 3 times, so that means 3 columns. And then you specify 100 pixels and the rows 2 times, and that creates the 2 rows. Everyone kind of understand what I mean by that? Perfect. And yeah, that's just a basic grid. A lot of the times when I build grids, this is like almost all I need is just that kind of structure. And as I go through, you'll see kind of the extra things that come in handy when you have certain instances, but this is the basics you need to build a basic CSS grid. Then you have grid template area. I mentioned the idea of grid areas before, but this is an example of how you might use grid area. So let's say you have the basic structure of header, main, sidebar, and footer. You could place your grid items in any of these areas, and that's how you basically specify. You can move around your grid a bit. And that's just kind of a basic overview of it, but we won't go into it much. Like, you can kind of look into it a bit afterwards, but it's pretty handy as well. If you just want to organize your grid a bit better. And then you have grid template, which is just a shorthand for the grid template columns and grid template rows. If you like using shorthands, then it would look like this. On the bottom here, where it says grid template, 100 pixel, 100 pixel, that's the row, and then slash your columns, so which is 300 pixels. By the way, the 100 pixels, like, there is a function that I'll mention later on that makes it a little bit easier to read, a little bit easier on the eyes. Then you have we have grid gap, or grid column gap and grid row gap. I typically use just grid gap because a lot of times I just need to evenly space the lines between my grid items. And that's pretty much what it does. It just says, okay, we're going to take this grid that I've created, and any lines between it, we're going to evenly space it by whatever I specify in the grid gap, which is 20 pixels. And this doesn't account for the outside container. The outside container, you can just add your usual padding. That will add padding to the outside. Yeah, that's basically it. Easy stuff. And then we have some more properties here. It's kind of a longer list. I won't go through every single one, but the basic idea is if you want to align your individual grid items a certain way, you can use justify items or align items. And the difference between justify and align is justify specifies on the row, on the horizontal index, and align is on the vertical column index. I don't know why I didn't just call it justify columns, but I don't know. I guess this is just what they chose. And then you have justify content, which takes the content as a whole, like all the grid items together, and then aligns it to your container. And then we have the shorthands of place items and place content, which just takes everything together and places it a certain way, or you just have your shorthand for whatever both items you need. And then we have some values here. I won't go over like extensive detail of them, how they work, but your basic start and end tells it to place it either to the left or right, depending on, or the top or bottom, depending on which axis you are. Then you have a center element, which I typically use a lot when I'm using grid, because like what it'll do is, let's say you have an example would be if you have a paragraph in your grid, and you just want to make sure that it's evenly on the center every single time, and then kind of depending on how much content you have within, you'll want to remain centered throughout. I've had this happen multiple times where I'd always have to try and center with JavaScript or some other means of CSS. And it's never always perfect, but I found with grid, it's almost always centered no matter what I do. And here's some examples of what it looks like actually when you apply it. So here we have align items on the align item center, which says look at each item based on the amount of space each item have and whatever is within it. Try and center it within the amount of pixels or percentage or whatever you use to specify it. So for here, if you have 100 pixels of a grid, it'll say, okay, well, we only have like 10 pixels worth of content within there, so we're going to just center it within that specific grid item. And then you have justify content, which is justify is basically align it on the row, on the horizontal axis, and then center means, okay, I want to place all this content in the center. If I have too much space on the sides, it's going to just center it. I could specify start and have it placed on the left here, or I can have it specify end and it placed on the right side. And then we have grid container. Grid containers justify content space around. Space around says grid's going to use whatever space is around it. The content's going to use whatever space is around it, and so we're going to evenly space it around. And as you see here, the two center spaces are even, and then it has it splits the space on the ends by half, so that's why it's not like evenly spaced on the ends as well. But I don't know, that's just how it works. I've just noticed so. And then we have the concept of grid auto flow. So what this means is right now, if you have like 3 columns and you say have another column you add to it. Let's say you add another div. What it's going to do is it's going to put it on the row axis, or it's going to put it on the next row. You can change it so it actually just continues along the columns. So for example here, I have a grid, Oh yeah, the repeat 5, that's what I meant by you can actually make it look a little bit better rather than specifying 100 pixels 5 times. But yeah, so what we have here is just a grid with my columns specified by 5 and then 1 row. I have a grid gap of 20 pixels, so you can see the gap between. But I want to, let's say, I just want it to continue going in the actual column. I just want to keep going. So what I do is I specify grid auto flow column, and what it'll do is grid will try and place it, it will just place it on the horizontal axis with the columns, and then it'll try and fit it in, but since we don't have anything specified for the amount of, like, the implicit grid, it's just going to try and squeeze it all in there. That's why it, like, looks really crummy there with this, like, the 6th and 7th item. But this is where the next thing comes in, which is grid auto rows, grid auto columns. This allows you to specify if I have any extra columns or if I have any extra rows, I want it to take a certain amount of height, or I want it to take a certain amount of width. So what we have here in our example is I don't have any sort of grid auto specified, and it's trying to place it on the next rows, but it doesn't know what height to make, so it's just the grid is trying to guess, okay, well, based on the amount of spacing I have within this element, I'm going to give it like 50 pixels instead of the 100 I've specified in the layer 2. I don't want that to happen, so what I can do is I can specify grid auto rows 100 pixels, and what that says is if I have any more rows, then they're automatically going to be spaced out by 100 pixels. So it comes in handy. And then continue with the properties. This is what you would place on the grid items. So we talked about the grid container, which you can specify in there. Now we're talking about the children elements, which are like your item 1, item 2, item 3, and all that stuff. And you're going to specify what you can actually do within those. So the idea of grid column start and grid row start, these are grid column start and grid row start, grid column end, grid row end. This basically says we're going to take all those lines I mentioned earlier on the grid, so those lines between each column, between each row, and you're going to use this to specify where exactly you want your grid item to be placed on that grid, on that part of the grid. And you can use grid column and grid row as shorthands. Sometimes that's all that's necessary, and that's what I'm going to use in my example. But yeah, that's pretty much what it says. You can even span your column across multiple lines as well. So you could say like, I want my column, or I want my item to start at the first column, but I want to end at the 5th, and it just spans the whole thing, and it'll just take up that amount of space. So this property comes in handy at that point. And this is an example where a base example would be used. Let's say you just want to mess up your whole grid. I just want the 3rd item on the 5th 5th column. Not something you typically want to do because it's just places things out of order and confuses people. But you have that option available, and sometimes designs just might require that. Who knows? I've had examples where clients say, I want this element to appear above here in mobile because it's more important. It's like, okay, you can either do that with JavaScript, or you can do that with some sort of funky CSS, or you just make it a grid and then you can place it above. Obviously, trying to convince a client otherwise because it's not proper, structure, but it's an example of how you can actually use this effectively. But yeah, here I specify column 5, so I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line. And place that 3rd column there instead of in the actual order. And I specify the 1st row, so we'll say, okay, I'll place it in the 1st row instead of 2nd row. Pretty easy stuff, but it's also, like I said, pretty handy for some situations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, justify and align, you can use that to position the element within itself. So let's say you didn't specify in the container you want everything to be centered, like if it's possible. You could do that on the individual items themselves. So what I have here, I have an example where, again, similar, I place that item in the 5th row, the 5th column and the 1st row. And I say, okay, based on the amount of space, I want to align it to the bottom. So I say, align self, being the 3rd item, at the end. And then, because it specifies align is the column in the vertical axis, so you're like, okay, I'll align that to the bottom because that's the end of the column. And same with the row, you can do it with rows, the justify self, you can place it on the horizontal axis and say, okay, at the end of, on the right side of the grid item, I want it to just align to the end. Obviously it doesn't look good there because we don't have a specified width on this item, but it's just an example how it could be used to align it to the right. And this is actually a fun one here. So you don't have to use pixels for everything, thank God. You can use a bunch of other properties. You can use you can use auto, which it automatically tries to, based on the width of the element or the height, it automatically tries to place it that way. And then you have pixels, you have EM and REM, and you also have percentages. But there's also this new value that's available to you, which I really like. It's called fractional units, aka variable space or free space. It just says, okay, based on the amount of space within this column, I'm gonna change the size of this element to match that. So in this example here, we have 2FR and 6FR. Okay, two fractional units, 6 fractional units. How does it determine how to space that out? What it does is it adds up the amount of free space you specified. So in this case, it would be 8. And it says, okay, well, this whole thing is 8 free space long. So I'm going to take 2, place that there, and then the rest is going to be 6 free space. And it doesn't account for your grid gap. So like, or sorry, it does account for your grid gap. So if I specify 20 pixels in the gap, it's going to adjust to say, okay, well, that doesn't count, so we're just going to take out the other free space and put it there.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How does VA use percentages or EM for the grid gap? Can you use something else than pixel for the grid gap?
You can use REMs and EMs. I haven't actually tried using it with percentages yet because typically I don't need to with the free space. I imagine it just takes the percentage of what's available, but I'm not sure. I haven't actually experimented with it yet. Because with fractional units, I don't need to use percentages anymore for this. I don't have to rely on that. Technically, I could say, okay, I want to have this grid column be 50%, 50%, and I'll take 50%. But then if you have any gap in there, you kind of have to account for that. Otherwise, it'll just extend the grid further. So if I had 20 pixels in that grid gap, but I also specify percentage, then like 50%, 50%, it's just going to go overboard. It's just going to go over the actual container. So that's why I use fractional units instead, because it almost acts like percentages. You could say one fractional unit, and it'll be equivalent to 50-50, but it'll account for the amount of space specified in the grid gap.
If you use fractional, do you need to specify width for the grid container?
You can if you want to. You don't have to. It just will take whatever space you have specified available. So like, let's say you have like a bunch of paragraphs within those grid items. It'll take whatever amount of space is in that paragraph and kind of apply that. It'll just, what's the word? It will consider the amount of space you have available in there, and then create expand the container based on that. Is that gonna answer your question, or is it good? Okay, perfect. Sure. Mm-hmm. So in that case, I mean, you can set the size of the, you can set, like, what it'll do is, let's say you set the columns to be, 50%, 50%, if we're just going with that example. The images will automatically adjust to that size, especially if you specify the width of the images at 100%. It'll say take 100% of that container, and they should be evenly placed if you have a height auto to those images as well. You can, yeah, yeah, because typically when I have images on a site, usually I'll have them I always have the height as auto because you never want the height to be different because it'll mess with the ratio of the image and it'll just look really crummy and whatnot. And I try and make sure the image is like the perfect amount of ratio per whatever I'm putting in. So if I have let's say a sidebar and it's 300 pixels, I always try and make sure the image is like 300 pixels wide. And there are ways you can do that. You can, like within Drupal, you can use image styles and whatnot to help with that. But does that answer your question, or is it? Okay, perfect. Any other questions before I move on? There's a lot of information dumped there, so. Oh, perfect. All right. And this is just another example of how you can use fractional units, but with the rows. So what it does, I have a first row is one fractional unit, the second row is 2 fractional units, and the third row is 3 fractional units. And you can see how it incrementally increases based on the amount of fractional units you use. And so what it says here is like, okay, the base amount we have here is around 50 pixels, I think, is what it was. So what's going to say is, okay, the first one's going to be 50 pixels. The second row is going to be double that because we have 2 fractional units, so it's going to be 100 pixels. And the third row is going to be 150 fractional units because 3 times 50 is 150. And then the total of the actual container, because there's no specified height on the container, is going to be 100, or it's going to be 300. Yes, math. It's going to be 300 pixels. So you can kind of see, based on this, how it kind of leverages the fractional units. And then we have grid functions. I mentioned repeat a little while ago, but that's handy if you have a large amount of columns listed on your grid. So let's say you have a good example is like sometimes if you want to use it for your header and you know, okay, my navigation, I'm going to have 3 navigation items and I want it to evenly space throughout. Then you can say, okay, I want it to be like, I don't know, like 50 pixel, 50 pixel, pixel, whatever. But you don't want to specify that 5 times or 10 times. So you just say repeat 5 times 20 pixels. It's just for the lazy. But it makes it so much more readable too. And then we have something called min-max. This idea, the whole idea of this is that it just specifies this is your max amount of, well, it's the equivalent to min width and max width, but if you want to specify it within your grid column. So technically I could say, okay, I want my minimum, let's say I have 1 column. I want that column to be a minimum width of 100 pixels, and I want the max width to be 300 pixels. So if you're resizing the browser and you're trying to limit that kind of amount of width it will go to, you can specify that with min-max. In terms of browser compatibility, it's not always available, so it's one thing you have to check. A site like Can I Use to make sure that it's usable within the browser you're supporting. But it's a pretty handy function if that's what you want to do. I haven't really used it that much, but you can kind of see the where it might be used. There's also another one called fit content, which allows you to, it basically says, I want this to fit within this content, but it's not highly available, so I didn't really want to specify that too much in this presentation. But it's another one you could potentially use as well. All right, let's take a bit of a breather. There's a lot there. Let's go with some of the pros and cons of grid. So some of the pros, and a lot of this is based on my personal experience learning it for the last little while. I find CSS Grid is pretty easy to learn, especially if you're just using it for like a basic layout. It's pretty easy to learn and apply to your code. And the great thing about it, it's usually less code than what I would usually use. Like our company Open, we usually use a grid framework like Suzy to help with a lot of our sites, especially when you're supporting like IE10. It's kind of hard to use something like Flexbox to its like for every situation. But with this, it's usually a lot less code because it's just applying like a couple of properties usually, and maybe your responsive styles if you have that. And because there's less code, you have reduced file sizes, and then reduce file sizes, you reduce load times, kind of keeps going from there. And I find it's a lot faster to develop things over time, like using this, because it's just, you don't have to worry about it too much. It just kind of works, which is great. As I mentioned earlier, it's great for large layouts, and also there's the idea of nesting grids, which is great. You don't have to. It's not like you can only use this once on a page. Like similar to Flexbox, you can use it multiple times throughout a page. So you can have grid applying to the outer layout of your page, but then you can have it for specific components on your page as well. The cons, though, it's not as great at handling only a single dimension layout. So like if you're only using it for rows or only using it for columns, it's not as good as something like Flexbox where it can evenly displace everything. That example I gave earlier about like the navigation, probably Flexbox would be a bit better for that situation, just because with grid you'd almost have to specify it as like 10 FR or sorry, one FR 10 times to get it like to be evenly spaced if you only have like 3 navigation items or something. Whereas at Flexbox, it's usually is pretty evenly spaced out when I apply it. And then we have the IE problem as usual. Every dev has to go through this. But the problem with IE is it requires you to use an explicit grid. It doesn't play with implicit grids very well. It will just say, okay, I want to have a 3-column grid, but what IE will require you to do is actually specify in its grid each column, each item in that column, to say I want this item in this part of the column. You have to explicitly, you basically have to mention, hey, I want this item in the first column, and then the next one you have to go, I want this item in the second column, third column, which is kind of a pain, but at least it's usable. It's something that can still be used in IE. It's just you have to have basically a separate thing for IE. And there are ways to target IE 10 and IE 11 only. But yeah, that's just more of a pain than anything else. But there's a great article, and I'll post this slide after. But there's a great article here by Rachel Andrews. She actually specifies what sort of properties are available in IE, and how it's used and what it's compared to an actual grid. So it says here like, oh, okay, the equivalent to grid row start is MS grid row. Or grid template columns, it's just MS grid columns. And the reason it's like that is because IE and IE10 use an older implementation, so they require like those specific properties instead. In terms of browser support, like I said, large majority of modern browsers and a lot of previous versions support CSS grid, and right now everything's green along your major browsers, like even Edge. Like, you know, I give props to Edge. Like, it's actually a lot better than its previous iterations. You know, they've actually done a good job with it. But yeah, IE 10 and 11 partial support, as I mentioned, and then you have some mobile browsers, which naturally mobile browsers are all to be different, and especially native browsers. But those two don't support like Opera Mini and BlackBerry browser. They don't support it, but a lot of instances on mobile, you probably don't even need grid really, a lot of the time. But if you did, a good thing about grid is it does allow you to some flexibility with backup. So if you wanted to say apply display grid on an element and then say have a backup of display table, so that on mobile it'll display as a table, or on IE it'll display as a table, you can totally do that. Grid just doesn't apply your floats. It doesn't apply that stuff because it just ignores it, which is great. It's like if you just want to use grid as it is right now, you can say nah, IE. You can just display a table and whatever. If it's a little bit uneven, whatever. But it honestly depends on your client. Some clients, or it depends on who uses your browser as well. It depends what you want, really. But there's a lot of ways around it, so you can still use grid. And just compare it to other layouts and frameworks. Again, mentioned like Flexbox is a one-dimensional grid system. It's great in its own ways, and it's great for aligning content within certain elements. And it's can be less code at times, even less code than CSS grid sometimes. But you know, it really depends. Like if you've used it before, you kind of get an idea of where Flexbox can be used comparatively to CSS grid. And the good thing about it is it has slightly better browser support than CSS grid. It's been around a bit longer, so you know you still have partial support in IE 11 and IE 10, but it's more for certain properties that just aren't available. And then, as I mentioned earlier, like Open uses Suzy for a grid layout. It's basically a grid layout engine for Sass, so you can use specific functions to say, I want to create this 2-column grid or whatever. And then what Sass will do is it'll compile it, and then it'll push it to CSS and say, oh, now everything displays in 2 columns. Great, amazing. It's like magic. It's very it's very flexible and extensive, so there's a lot of different ways you can use it, a lot of different types of grids you can use with it, and as I mentioned earlier, outputs your custom grid structure however you want it. So it outputs in the CSS, you don't have to worry about it. But the problem with it and a lot of other layouts has a bit of a learning curve, so there's even a book for it. I imagine there's a book for CSS Grid too, but it's probably small. But like, there's a book for it, and looking at the site and just going through it again, I'm like, wow, that was a lot of stuff I had to learn over that time frame. And the thing is also, it produces more code than Grid or Flexbox because it's essentially calculating your different grid layouts. Like, it uses a mix of floats, percentages, margins to basically align your grid the way you want it. And if you don't use Sass, it's kind of tricky because it requires a bit of Sass knowledge and configuration as well. And again, a lot of helpful documentation for it. It just takes time to read through it. And there's some other layouts you probably come across as well in your experiences. So there's something called Bourbon Neath. There's a classic Bootstrap, which, as mentioned earlier, seems to be used throughout a lot of sites. Responsive grid system, Foundation, Gridly, the list goes on. And these are good starting points. I've used some of them before. My only thing is there's a lot of extra code, and again, you have to learn each one, basically. They all have their different classes they use or different methods they apply everything, and that's the only thing. So the question is what to use. Oh my god, you learned so much today, but which one do we use now? It's a trick question. You can use all of them if you want. You can use all of them together. That's basically what I do at my job. I use CSS Grid for specific instances because, again, we have to support IE10 in some of our sites. So you won't. So the trick is, like, use it when you're able to. And we're all I assume a lot of us are developers, if not all. But like, we should just be trying these new things out and see what works for us because it makes us better developers. It also makes us better, makes our products better and faster and whatnot. Some example links or not example links, just links. Here's some links where you can actually learn CSS Grid. I've used these a lot extensively while learning it. So you have, like, Mozilla has a lot of developer documents just for CSS Grid. You have your W3 link here. We have cssgrid.io, which is a video series from a developer I follow, and it's a very helpful tutorial. Like, it's very easy to understand when this guy's talking. And then you have CSS Tricks. They have a complete guide on Grid, which again gives pictures and everything, and it's a great guide. So, any questions? Sure.
Do you have any polyfills or backwards compatibility tricks for something that users love, or does anything exist to address that gap?
Yeah. So specifically IE, there's that article I mentioned. You can search for should I use this in IE, and it'll give you an extensive of where you can use it and where you can't use it. There isn't really any polyfills available. This is just available directly in the browser, so you should be able to open up your browser and it's there. But if you needed to use any sort of backups for any browsers that you find isn't available, what Grid will do is, if it's enabled, then it'll just ignore sort of properties like your floats, your what else do you have? You have your floats, I think some margins, specific things like that. It'll just ignore these properties. I'm trying to remember exactly which ones they are, but it's kind of hard to remember on the spot. But essentially, it'll ignore it when it's available, but if your browser doesn't support Grid, then all the Grid properties, they just will be ignored by the browser, and it'll just use your backups that are available. So if you write, I want to float this and have a 50% width for a 2-column grid, it'll just take that and say, okay, cool, we'll use this in your browser. So it doesn't really require any polyfills or anything like that. It's just some backup CSS available if you need it. And a lot of times, based on my experience, I haven't needed it. I just apply it. When it comes to IE, I just have an IE-specific media query that only applies the IE-specific implementation of Grid. So it's pretty easygoing in that sense. Does that answer your question? Do you think it was good? Great, perfect. Any other questions? Sure.
If you use it in a view with dynamic content, let's say a load more button that add items.
Yeah.
How does it work? You don't have to specify each line.
So that's where the tricky thing with IE10, for example, is you would have to specify with each grid item where it should be placed in the grid. Otherwise, it'll do this fun thing where it just stacks on top of each other in one column. So, yeah, so that's why with when it comes to dynamic content, I typically either won't use grid, or I'll make sure that if I am I won't typically use grid in those situations. I'll probably use like Suzy, or I'll use Flexbox. But again, that's because I have to support IE10. If you don't have to support it, and you just support more modern browsers like your Chrome, Firefox, and all that stuff, then just go. It'll know. It'll know with the implicit grid, if you set it, to set those specific items the amount of height or width that you need for each one. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. You have to support those old browsers. I still hear people saying they support IE9, and I don't know. But I mean, like I said, you could use backups in those situations too. Like if you just want to use grid for all the modern browsers, and then for any other browsers, you can just have you can just